and welcome to the Hamilton Security Forum. My name is Alex Sturza, and I'm president of the Alexander Hamilton Society here at GW. We are a nonpartisan organization dedicated to the intellectual and professional development of our members. And I hope today's forum, which we've been working on for over 6 months, will show a little bit of how we do that. While we are exclusively focused on international affairs, we are open to people of all majors and backgrounds to join us for our weekly Tuesday evening discussions. That'll include our reading series, which we just started this week. It's on The Long Game by Rush Doshi. It's very influential. It landed him a job on the National Security Council for the last 3 years in charge of Taiwan and China policy. And so we're going to be doing that throughout the rest of the semester, along with our roundtable discussions, one of which was specifically on U.S. alliances in preparation for this event. And we also have speaker events. So the next one, in addition to today, will be on Sudan, the civil war there. A Sudanese GW alum is coming back to campus. He's currently a PhD student. And he's going to talk about his experiences and his research on Sudan, on really a terrible humanitarian crisis there, and really has not gotten enough attention. And then moving forward, we also have social events. Moving forward on a few Tuesdays after that, on October 15th, we're going to have a policy writing workshop. That's very helpful in our careers, perhaps in government and outside of government, because it's not the same thing as academic writing. And so we're going to have Rachel Hoff, someone with extensive experience in DC, come and do a workshop to help practice that. And while our academic programming is the core of our organization, we also do social events. Earlier this semester, we had a farmers market trip to Duan. And we're going to be doing that again in a few weeks during Parents Weekend. I know we're all students here. So if you want to bring out your parents for that and help buy some food, that would be excellent.
Yeah, get your parents involved.
And then we also are going to have a social event with the American University and the Georgetown University and the Johns Hopkins University chapters of AHS. So if you don't really like the people here at GW, we also provide opportunities to meet people on other campuses. And we're also doing a site visit to the Atlantic Council. That was supposed to be next week, but due to scheduling issues, it's been moved probably to a couple weeks from now. So I'm very excited about that. And then if you want to learn more about our organization, all of our social media accounts will be on this link tree. In addition to that, we have a mentorship program, which is new this year. And so if you're a first-year transfer student, new to DC, new to GW, that will be an opportunity for you all to learn more about that, make a connection, make a friend. That's what AHS is all about. And if you want to help us out with our leadership to help put together events like this one, whether it be our podcast, because yes, we do also have a podcast, or other social academic programming, we recommend you all apply to that. The deadline for that will be on Sunday, so a little over 48 hours. And enough said about AHS. I wanted to mention a couple things about Mr. Coffey and Professor Joja. Mr. Coffey, a few weeks ago, was awarded the Order of Merit by Ukrainian President Zelensky. So if you want a preview as to what he thinks about Russian aggression, there is a clue. And among other things, Dr. Joja is, not very coincidentally, the professor of a Europe and Transition class I'm taking right now. So I really enjoyed learning more about the EU and its various challenges. I recommend that you all try and get that class. It's available next semester. You can ask for a bigger room next semester because the demand is outreaching the space. But with that out of the way, let us begin.
Right. So we have about an hour, is that correct?
Yes, that will also include questions and answers.
Yes.
Oh no, that is
all right. All right, thank you so much. Thank you for being here, and thank you to Alex and everyone else at AHS GW for putting this together. We hope we're going to provide an interesting discussion for you all. Luke and I can pretend that we don't know each other, but we've been working for many years together, and we're on very similar pages when it comes to looking at the transatlantic space. Yep. But we promised today, in line with the event, that we will be talking about NATO, the Transatlantic Alliance, in the context of both cooperation and competition, And I propose that we start with the better part, the cooperation, and then turn to competition. I'll be asking Luke a series of questions on my end, and then we look forward to opening the discussion from you to hear your questions and your comments as well and feedback. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of NATO members and support for Ukraine and Russia and China, maybe it makes sense to start with a question about the value of NATO overall. And I'll premise that with the fact that on the one hand, we have narratives, and you see that every day in media, about how strong the alliance is, stronger than ever before. Some people dub it, but on the other hand, if you're asking people beyond the headlines, policymakers, analysts, people who are working on NATO, particularly in Europe, there's a lot of anxiety around NATO. The number one being the US elections and what that could mean for the alliance overall. And the other one being when you're getting closer to the front in Ukraine, in member states of NATO around it, essentially NATO Article 5 scares. We have now, I think, the 7th, 8th instance of Iranian, Russian-launched drones falling on NATO territory with no response from the alliance, with calls to do more, and so far luck in terms of no victims. But we see on the other hand Russia escalating, and so fears are increasing both at the strategic level, what's the future of NATO, but also at the operational level and really on the ground. So Luke, what's the value of NATO today?
Thanks, that's a great question to start us off. First, I want to echo your thanks to Alex and GW's Alexander Hamilton Society chapter for putting on this forum and inviting me to speak. I love the Alexander Hamilton Society. I've spoken to numerous chapters all across America. In fact, about 12 hours ago, I was at another chapter, finishing up another event at Hamilton Sydney College. I got home last night at about midnight, and I'm here today. That's how much I love Alexander Hamilton Society. You know, to talk about NATO, you have to first remind yourselves why Europe matters and why Europe is important. And then you can quickly figure out why NATO is important to the United States. There are a couple of very good reasons why Europe still matters to the US. We have a set of normative, values-based reasons that for some reason in our society today doesn't resonate in the same way they probably would have 20, 30 years ago. But it is a fact that some of America's closest and oldest allies are found in Europe. That there's no other place around the world where we share many of the same ideas and beliefs of, freedom of press, independent judiciary, free markets, freedom of religion, these basic principles and ideas of human rights. But there are actual, more practical issues that impact most Americans on a day-to-day basis that they perhaps don't even realize, and that is the economic reason Europe matters. Perhaps the future is in Asia. I don't know. I wouldn't doubt it. But what I know right now is that half of the world's GDP is found between North America and Europe. I do know that Europe provides 3 times the amount of foreign investment into the United States than Asian countries do. I do know that 48 out of 50 American states export more to Europe than they do to China, including California, Hawaii, these Pacific Ocean facing states. And when an American is building a product to be exported or providing a service to be exported to Europe, that is an American job. And right now, Vladimir Putin is trying to undermine the stability and security in Europe that has led to the economic prosperity across that continent that has not only benefited the US economy, but ultimately the American worker. And if you're from the heartland of America, where I'm from in Missouri or Oklahoma or Kentucky, and you're a laborer, your goods that you're manufacturing are 4 to 5 times more likely to go to Europe than they are to China. So ultimately, NATO as an intergovernmental security alliance is the primary guarantor for the security of America's largest export market. So it's nice to say, yes, France our first ally, Britain our closest ally, we share common values. But if you want to get to the brass tacks of it, it's about the economy and that economic relationship we have with Europe.
All right, so if the, is this working?
I'm so noisy and loud, I didn't even know my microphone wasn't working.
Is it better now?
Did everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay.
What about me? Yeah, okay, good. If there is economic benefit and prosperity that is driving or driving from behind the alliance, and you need security to provide for prosperity, then what about an assessment of NATO now? We just celebrated over the summer in Washington, D.C., 75 years of NATO with a big summit. And there was a lot of criticism around it too. I think I've heard it from you, Luke, as well as from myself too, about the fact that this was set to be more of a celebration than putting on the agenda the painful issues or the challenges and threats that NATO is facing. So if you're looking now at the alliance in terms of what security it is providing, felt and perceived security on both sides of the Atlantic, particularly in light of the largest scale war that Europe has been facing in 70 years, Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Where would you say we're now with the alliance?
The alliance is in a pretty good place. It's 75 years old. If you show me someone who's been married 75 years, and I'll show you a lot of drama, ups and downs, a lot of love, a lot of hate probably over the course of those 75 years. And that's the same with any relationship in life, whether it's interstate relationships between countries and alliances, or your domestic arrangements at home. But we should remember where NATO started and how it's progressed over the years. In 1949, when it was founded, it was designed to deter the spread of communism and Soviet advancements into Western Europe, and if necessary, required to defeat the Soviet Union and later the Warsaw Pact on the battlefield. During the Cold War, it did exactly what it was meant to do, I think quite successfully. Obviously, in the early 90s, there were questions being raised about, well, what do we do about NATO now that the Soviet Union is gone and there's relative peace and stability in Europe? And a lot of countries started reducing their defense spending, the size of their militaries. The U.S. was pulling hundreds of thousands of troops out of Europe back to the United States. And then the crises in the Balkans happened, predominantly in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also in Kosovo and Serbia, and a bit of Macedonia. And this kind of re-energized NATO's purpose. And NATO got involved, stabilized the situation in the Balkans in the late 90s, and this was considered a success story. But also, interestingly at the time, this was considered an out-of-area operation. Today, when we think of NATO getting out of area, we think of Afghanistan or Libya or something. In the 90s, going to the Balkans, that was considered out of area. And then things calmed down, and then 9/11 happened, and then that energized NATO again. And for the first time, NATO invoked Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, which in a nutshell states an attack on one is an attack on all. It's important to say, as we're talking about Article 5 now, that there are no triggers for Article 5. Invoking Article 5 is a political decision. Anything could be an Article 5 attack if the now 32 members of the North Atlantic Council believe that it was an attack on the alliance. So, they invoked Article 5, and then NATO spent a number of years conducting counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan and other counterterrorism operations and training and this sorts of thing. And then in 2010, 2011, when NATO, along with President Obama and Prime Minister David Cameron decided that by the end of 2014, NATO's combat mission will be over and it'll transfer these responsibilities to the Afghans. That's when NATO started losing kind of like its focus again, right? So they knew it was transitioning out, it was transitioning to the Afghans. And by 2013, you had the same rhetoric you were hearing in the past. What's the point of NATO? What's going to do now? And then Crimea was annexed in 2014. And I would say from 2014 to where we are today, this has sharply focused the minds inside NATO and really brought NATO back to that core mission of collective defense, territorial defense, and it has energized the alliance to take steps along these lines. I'm a back to basics guy. NATO doesn't have to be everywhere in the world doing everything, but it does, according to Article 6 of the 1949 treaty, it has to be, and I quote, in the North Atlantic area, north of the Tropic of Cancer, able to defend its member states. So I'm glad to see NATO's kind of reverted back to its core mission. In terms of the summit, we can get into Ukraine and Ukraine's prospects for NATO, and we can talk about the history of NATO and Ukraine enlargement and engagement. And spoiler alert: NATO enlargement did not, cause Russia to invade Ukraine. I was disappointed at the summit. I was hoping that NATO would extend an invitation for Ukraine to join, not bring Ukraine into the alliance immediately, but extend an invitation with the final date of membership to be determined when all the alliance members believe that the security situation in Ukraine was satisfactory. Nobody wants a country brought into the alliance that's at war with another country. I think that everyone agrees on that. Even President Zelensky himself has said a number of times he understands that Ukraine will not join NATO while they're at war with Russia. But we had an opportunity to make history at the summit by extending that invitation, and instead all we did was celebrate history, and I think that was a missed opportunity.
Yeah. So then delving a little bit deeper into Ukraine. There's a lot of confusion in terms of what NATO does for Ukraine, and I always try to explain to students when we get to that session. I know there's a few of my students this semester today here. I tell them, well, actually, technically, NATO as an organization is not sending military aid to Ukraine. Member states do on a voluntary basis in coalitions that we have that include also non-member states such as Japan and South Korea on the other side in Asia. And we have some member states that are explicitly against military support for Ukraine, and hence we have this situation. So if you are to look at NATO as an organization in terms of helping Ukraine, because it's not just about sending ammunition rounds, it's also political support and deterrence near the borders of Ukraine, etc. What does NATO do for Ukraine? That's one thing. And then the second part of the question is, can we look a little bit deeper into what the more relevant, larger member states are doing 2.5 years plus, almost 3 years into the war? You can pick and choose to focus on Germany or France or the UK, but of course one country that is particularly interesting for us today is the United States. And we are in a difficult situation, if I may say so, to add kind of data to the situation. So earlier this week, President Zelensky of Ukraine gave a more recent interview to Fareed Zakaria on CNN and said the level or the proportion, the ratio of ammunition rounds consumed right now on the front lines is 12-1 in favor of Russia. That tells us a little bit about the aid that we have overall for Ukraine. And then in a few days, on September 30th, the presidential drawdown capacity right off the White House is expiring, and the White House is sitting on about $5 to $6 billion of military aid it could have sent to Ukraine over the summer, and has not. So where are we when it comes to NATO and more relevant member state support?
Well, it's an important observation it's an important point that there's a distinction between what NATO as an institution does and what its member states do. I think it's best that support for Ukraine is done largely outside the framework of NATO, because that gives countries, let's say like Hungary, too much veto power and influence over the matter. Currently, there's something called the Ramstein Contact Group, and it's this informal network of like-minded countries who want to assist Ukraine. Some assist as a lot, some don't assist very much, some offer political support, just there are different degrees of support, but it's ad hoc, it's informal, and you can do what you want, what you're comfortable with politically at home, and that no one can block anything. I think that's probably a good way forward. In terms of what the countries have been doing, I would say obviously the leaders in Europe on a per capita basis are the Baltic states. In some cases have given all of their equipment in some categories, whether it's artillery or javelin anti-tank missiles or other munitions. They've just given it all to the Ukrainians, and as a percentage of GDP, they're giving huge amounts of aid. 1 to 2%, 2.5% of their GDP to Ukraine, to aid Ukraine. In terms of the big countries, the leader is definitely the United Kingdom. They were leading the way from the very beginning under the previous government, and then currently under, nothing's changed under the Labour government as well. They were, the first to announce tanks. They were providing advanced anti-tank weapons early in the conflict when Europeans were still debating on, whether or not any weapon should be given. They were the first, curiously, to announce F-16s, even though they don't have any. But that discussion kind of forced the other allies to get on board. They were the first to give long-range weapons, the Storm Shadow air-launched cruise missile that have been used very effectively in occupied Crimea. So I think the UK has really stepped up to the plate and led by example here. Now, in terms of the United States, I find it depressing, really. It's everything we give to Ukraine seems to be a day late and a dollar short. We have this reluctance to give Ukraine what it needs to win, and we just provide them with what they need to survive. And this just prolongs the war. Every major piece of equipment we've given to Ukraine has come after weeks, if not months, of internal political debate in the United States, needlessly, in my opinion. Had we given the Ukrainians Patriot missiles from the very beginning, then we would have had an impact that first fall of 2022 when Russia really ramped up its airstrikes. Had we started training them on main battle tanks and HIMARS and F-16s from the beginning, I think this war would look differently. And really, what the U.S. is getting, the American taxpayer is getting a bargain here. Even with the aid we provided, which has been substantial, don't get me wrong, but it's not enough and we can give more. But even with the aid we provided, we've seen the Ukrainians essentially dismantle or see them dismantling the conventional armed forces of the Russian Federation, which is one of our top geopolitical adversaries. And they're doing this for pennies on the dollar. You hear all these crazy stories out there about how much money we're spending on Ukraine, this and that. Let me put it to you like this way. In the 2.5 years been arming and supplying Ukraine, over the same period of time, this money has amounted to 0.2% of 1% of America's GDP output. 0.2% of America's GDP output. Pretend America's GDP output was represented by a dollar. Take 100 pennies. Take one of those pennies, cut that penny into 10 pieces, and then take 2 pieces away. That is the amount of money we have given to Ukraine. The idea that we cannot do more is ridiculous. Also, I don't buy this whole rhetoric now I'm about to go on a rant. So
Please.
someone's gonna have to like take the mic away, maybe. This idea that Americans are tired of forever wars, so we can't arm Ukraine. This is America's next forever war. Well, firstly, it's not America's next forever war for the obvious fact that we're not fighting in it. The Ukrainians haven't asked us to provide troops. They don't want American troops. They just want American equipment and American military assistance. I say this as a veteran of Afghanistan. 99.5% of Americans never served in Iraq or Afghanistan. America was never at war in Iraq or Afghanistan. The American armed forces were at war, but Americans were not at war. There was no special tax that was levied to fund these wars. There was no conscription or draft. It was all volunteer army. So the idea that the American society are so tired of Iraq and Afghanistan that we can't just help a country defend itself, I think it's nonsense. And we are also, because of what's happening in Ukraine, learning about the shortcomings in our own defense industrial base. So we're better prepared if we have to fight, God forbid, a near-peer adversary like China someday. I mean, imagine if we were learning that this country could only produce, like 40,000 155 millimeter rounds a month, while we were the ones getting shot at and killed. That would be a national scandal, in my opinion. But we're learning all these shortcomings when American troops aren't the ones fighting and dying in wars, and there's a lot of value for us for that. And all this may sound crass, okay, well, the Ukrainians are doing the fighting and dying, they're fighting Russia for us, they're helping us expose some of our shortcomings in our defense industrial base. And it would be crass if we were forcing the Ukrainians to fight, but we're not. They want to fight. They see this as existential. No one's forcing the Ukrainians to fight. So I think as long as the Ukrainians want to fight, we should be arming and supporting them to do so. But I don't want to get political, but either way in November, I'm pretty depressed when it comes to Ukraine. On one hand, you're going to possibly have some sort of half-baked peace deal forced onto Ukraine, which will just kick the war into the long grass, and then in a few years, Russia will be right back. I promise you that. Or you're going to have more of the same, dithering and indecisiveness of giving Ukraine giving Ukraine enough to make it look like you're doing something, but not enough for them to actually win. So it's, Ukraine's in a difficult spot right now.
Yeah, this is kind of something I agree, and I would even add to that there's a chance that after the elections, if the Democrats are winning, we will be seeing Ukraine forced to the negotiation table in a more elegant manner, right? But essentially, if the drawdown is not used, what argument can you make politically for the next Congress to approve another supplemental? And I haven't seen Vice President Harris having a different stance on Ukraine than President Biden. So it might be more elegant and more drawn out, but we might be looking at a similar situation. And this reminds me of a tweet I saw earlier today of Garry Kasparov, the famous Russian chess player, was commenting about President Biden inviting Zelensky to join us here at the White House next week, and saying President Zelensky will be offered one spoon, half a fork, and no knife.
Yeah.
All right, so we've talked a lot about cooperation. I want to ask you a couple more questions about NATO and competition, and then we'll open it up. The first, most obvious one is the big and half still walking elephant in the room, that is Russia. NATO has, we have at national level national security strategies. NATO has something similar called strategic concepts. The one that we have adopted most recently in 2023, Madrid Summit, I think, was a big change from what we've had with NATO strategic concept from 2010. In 2010, 2 years after the invasion of Georgia by Russia in 2008, and a few years before Russia moved militarily into Ukraine in 2014, we were calling within the NATO strategic concept, NATO's security strategy, Russia a partner. It was only last year, after the full-scale invasion, that we have now considered them the #1 threat. But that also tells us how much reluctance there has been among NATO member states to acknowledge that Russia is at war, even if it cannot afford to be in a direct confrontation with NATO in what we call hybrid or irregular warfare with NATO member states, and using Ukraine as a proxy. The Russians remind us of that every day. So if you are to assess now with the changes that we've made relatively recently to NATO's Russia policy, and looking also at the defense and deterrence that we are consolidating or trying to consolidate around what we call NATO's eastern flank, around Ukraine, the member states of NATO in Central and Eastern Europe. What's your assessment? How are we doing?
Well, since 2014, we've been doing a lot better. Let's just take a few of these issues like funding and defense spending. So back in 2006, there was an agreement amongst the NATO members at the time to spend 2% of GDP on defense. Nobody did it. Well, in 2014, when Russia invaded Crimea, 3 were doing it. The United States, the UK, and does anyone, just out of curiosity, know the third? Anyone want to take a guess? Greece, yeah, Greece, right? Because, and good, well done. You should actually come over here and give us that. Because Greece, is the way NATO defines defense spending includes like civil service, pensions in the Ministry of Defense, and retirement funds, and also Greece is like preparing to go to war with another NATO member, Turkey. So yeah, it was Greece. Fast forward to the summit, or this most recent summit over the summer. Now 23 countries are spending 2% of GDP. 23 out of 32. That's not bad. That's good. That's one of the great news stories out of the summit, in my opinion. And since 2014, European defense spending has increased year on year because of what Russia did in Crimea. And it's also in 2014 at the Wales summit, NATO repledged or reiterated its commitment to this 2% mark. So that's why it's still talked about today. But this has been a benchmark that's been around since, like I said, 2006. And you know what? There is one man most responsible for getting NATO members to spend more on defense, and his name is President Vladimir Putin. Undoubtedly, President Trump probably played a role in encouraging some Europeans along, but European defense spending was already increasing year on year before the Trump administration. Speaking to Europeans privately, I do have no doubt that his rhetoric helped light a fire under them. But there's one man that's really responsible for this, and that's Vladimir Putin. Now, when it comes to Russia, this is what NATO should be focused on. I mean, the best thing NATO can do for European security right now is to ensure that NATO's territory is adequately defended from any threat from Russia, and that Russian aggression is deterred. The best thing that NATO's members can do to help NATO's mission is to be arming Ukraine for the reasons I've discussed. But we have, I think, failed to recognize the historical significance of the times in which we live as it pertains to Russia. Now, many of you are too young to remember, but 1991, people were saying that this was the end of the Cold War, that the Soviet Union collapsed, and now we have this new geopolitical dynamic in Europe. I do not believe that the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. I think that's when the process started, and it's still collapsing today. History has this ability to condense the sense of time that we have. And historians 200 or 300 years from now, when they write about the collapse of the Soviet Union, they're going to lump this whole era into that chapter of that book, or maybe by then like the footnote of the book, who knows. But you know, they will include the two Chechen wars, Russia's invasion of Georgia in 2008, the ongoing occupation in Transnistria and Moldova, NATO enlargement, EU enlargement, annexation of Crimea in 2014, and a bunch of, you know, the fighting between Armenia and Azerbaijan over Karabakh, the skirmishes between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan over their land border. All of these things that are happening in that post-Soviet space, it's still a result of the Soviet Union collapsing. It hasn't finished yet. And perhaps historians will mark February of 2022 as the most consequential moment of this collapse. Whether Russia wins or Russia loses militarily in Ukraine, either way, I don't think that the borders of the Russian Federation as we know them today will look the same in 20 years. Either it's going to be bigger or it's going to be smaller. And we have to start thinking like this and preparing for this outcome. And this is why NATO remains just as relevant today as it was during the Cold War.
Yeah, it's quite interesting discussion also looking forward. Remember that Russia is still a federation with a lot of regions that have pretensions of national identity, and so that's also something.
And the first breakup in '91, where we got the Central Asian republics, the three countries in the South Caucasus, or the Baltic states, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, etc. This was the safety glass breaking, right? This was like when your car windshield gets shattered, it breaks in a clean, safe way. The next round of breakup, if it happens, is going to be like that single pane of glass in a 150-year-old house. It's going to break and shatter in unpredictable ways, in ways that will be dangerous to handle, unpredictable, and impossible to put back together. And that's what we need to be thinking about now. No one thought in the late 80s that the Soviet Union was going to, break up. And we shouldn't, there's no reason to assume that it won't break up further. When you look at the demographic makeup of Russia and the federalized system and everything else, it's not inconceivable that there would be a second round of disintegration. I wrote a paper about this in 2022, late 2022. I published it in December, and it became the most downloaded paper on the Hudson Institute website, even though I published it in December, and it landed me a spot on the Russian sanctions list. I can't say it's really changed my life all that much, but yeah, so that's kind of a badge of honor. But this is something that we have to start thinking about today.
And a lot of people are scared, and I think it makes sense to start talking about it, because it's not like we haven't done it before. In 1991, nuclear weapons were dispersed. They were in Ukraine, they were in Kazakhstan. We managed to solve that peacefully, so it's something that's food for thought. But we're delving now into something. One last question before we open it up, and that's China. China, that we see a big push from the United States within this NATO transatlantic space, and a lot more reluctance from the Europeans, who do not see themselves yet in this great power strategic competition, whatever you want to call it. But nevertheless, with the new strategic concept that we have now with NATO, with the push from the United States and some Europeans that maybe see a bit more of light when it comes to strategic vision long term, China has been introduced as, I think, a challenge to NATO. So what should NATO be doing when it comes to China?
So I have a minority opinion on this, admittedly. This is where the distinction between NATO as an institution and NATO's members is very important. NATO as an intergovernmental security alliance lacks the policy competencies required to deal with the challenges China currently poses to Europe. China poses, these questionable investments in infrastructure and, dubious 5G investments and the disinformation and all this other stuff are issues that NATO as an intergovernmental security alliance can't deal with. It doesn't have powers, NATO doesn't have a legislative body, it doesn't have powers to sanction, it doesn't have powers to force a member state to assess and investigate any potential threat from outside investment in a port. These are the policy competencies that are held at the member state level in most cases, and sometimes at the EU level. So it's important that NATO's members and also the European Union play a role in countering Chinese malign influence in the North Atlantic area, north of the Tropic of Cancer. But I don't believe in this concept of like global NATO and this sort of thing. I think if China becomes a military threat in the North Atlantic area, north of the Tropic of Cancer, to NATO's members, then we can have a different discussion about it. But even when you interpret the treaty as it has been done regarding NATO's area of responsibility, because it's the North Atlantic area, north of the Tropic of Cancer, it doesn't include Guam or even Hawaii. Like whenever North Korea was firing missiles over Guam, I remember reading in the European press, oh, this is going to drag us into war, NATO's going to be into war with North Korea. No, it's not. It's outside NATO's area, NATO's stated area of responsibility. So absolutely, China is, as NATO refers to it, a strategic enabler of Russia's war in Ukraine. Undoubtedly, China's taking measures to undermine the stability and security and the social cohesion in many European countries, and is trying to invest in infrastructure projects that undermines, our interests. But we have tools to deal with that, and NATO might be a tool in that toolbox, but it's not the toolbox itself.
All right. That should open up the discussion. I already see one hand, two hands, three hands. All right. Maybe we can start with the gentleman up front. Then we'll go. Oh, thank you. To the top, to the young lady, and then somewhere on the left there was a hand.
So wonderful having you here. Two quick questions. My first, really easy. What's the name of the paper you published?
Yeah, preparing for the final collapse of the Soviet Union or something. I mean, if you put into Google in my name, it'll definitely pop up. Basically, I argue that we have to start preparing for this possibility. That had we prepared for it in the 1980s, maybe the outcome would have been slightly different. But the risk I run by talking about this, first, I'm not advocating for regime change, or I'm not even advocating for the further collapse of Russia. But what I'm saying is we have to prepare for it. Problem is, when you talk about it in this town, you're either branded a neocon or a moron. Right, you're a moron because there's no way this is ever going to happen, or you're until it does happen, and then you're a moron because you didn't predict that it would happen, and you're part of the failed foreign policy establishment that has gotten all the decisions wrong over the past 2 decades, or you're a neocon because people think you're advocating for like regime change in Russia, which I'm not.
On that note, real quick, we learned in our classes that there was like studies on Soviet Union, and like people were going into IA careers in Soviet Unions, specializing in the Soviet Union up until the Berlin Wall collapse, and then they're like, now we need new careers. So the Berlin Wall collapse wasn't as predictable either. So it's definitely worth looking into. My follow-up question, Trump's rhetoric has been very clear regarding NATO. But recently we have seen individual member states and even former Secretary Jens Stoltenberg talking about NATO member states upping their commitment to Ukraine. Is it possible that should Trump get elected, so two things, did the US Congress make it to where any president cannot withdraw from NATO? And second, is it possible that if Trump were to be elected and try to force Ukraine into a half-baked deal, that that the NATO member states would step up and delay or be able to circumvent that because of their support or wider alliance support for Ukraine?
So making it, I guess, illegal or against the law or something for a president to withdraw from NATO. There are a lot of legal questions about what authorities a president would have for this, since this is a treaty ratified by the Senate and whatever. But President Trump would have to formally pull the United States out of NATO for him to end NATO. All you would have to say is, well, we're not defending NATO. So that would be enough right there. In terms of, could Europe continue on if in a hypothetical situation there's a deal forced onto the Ukrainians? Yeah, I guess in theory this could happen, although U.S. support is crucial. But there's been a lot of talk about Europe needs to do more to arm Ukraine and help Ukraine. By any measurement now, this was a good talking point for the anti-Ukraine crowd early on in the war, but now, I mean, by any measurement, whether it's military assistance, humanitarian assistance, economic help, refugee support, Europe spends just as much, if not even more, or committed just as much, if not even more, than the United States has. So it's pretty balanced right now, and considering that it's in our direct interest for the reasons I outlined before, we should be thankful that the Europeans are doing this. Of course, they have a huge stake in the matter too. But it all depends. There are a lot of European countries who share the view of Biden, who share Biden's probably private view and Trump's very public view, and probably the Harris's views are probably future view aligned with Biden. They probably would like to draw a line under this one way or the other, even if it comes to throwing the Ukrainians under the bus.
Yeah, actually in continuation of the Vance peace plan, that's the most brazen. Over the last few days, there's been a number of Europeans jumping at the occasion leaders to say, well, maybe another peace plan, or we can give a new one. How can we give more Ukrainian territory to Russians?
Yeah.
So there's a lot of political opportunism is jumping on a peace deal. Question in the back, yes, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for talking today, and thank you for your huge support to Ukraine. And I wanted to ask, my question consists of two parts. First of all, the Congress will vote for that fiscal budget very soon, and if you can say an estimated amount, in your opinion, which should be dedicated to Ukraine, that would be my first part. And the second part, I don't know if you're aware, there's a Ukrainian Action Summit happening starting this Monday in DC. And the idea that we'll try to talk to Congress and explain why more help should be dedicated. How do you think this should be addressed? What should be pointed out to congressmen, and why should be this important?
Yeah, thank you. On your first question, it's difficult to put a dollar amount on it. We need to look at capabilities. We need to figure out what we're trying to achieve, and then have our military planners plan for that outcome. Now, if I was, I'm often asked, how do you define victory in Ukraine? Honestly, as an American, my opinion of what victory is irrelevant, because I'm not the one fighting and dying on the front lines. But we are supporting Ukraine. We have to have planning assumptions on what weapons and systems and aid we give to Ukraine. So, the planning assumption that we should have is the full restoration of Ukraine's internationally recognized borders from 1991. That should be the end state. If along the way the Ukrainians decide that they want to negotiate a settlement or they want to cease fire, then we should support them through that process with just as much energy and commitment. So I don't want to put a dollar. I know, here's what I know. What we're spending now is not enough. It needs to be more, but I don't want to put an exact dollar sign on it. On your second question, I think there's been the best way to get members of Congress to continue to support Ukraine, which I have to say, being on Capitol Hill a lot, coming from Hudson Institute, which is ideologically conservative think tank, I speak to a lot of Republican members and staffers, and there's still a strong support for Ukraine. They may not advertise it, they may not promote it publicly, but I find that it's still there. And also with the American people too. Perhaps there's less focus now, 2.5 years into this war than there was before. I remember going back home to rural Missouri, and I would see in someone's front yard a Trump 2024 sign next to Ukrainian flag. Because Americans instinctively support the underdog. We instinctively want to kick it to Russia whenever we can. And that's where I think American society is at large. Now, 2.5 years into this conflict, American support for Ukraine is very much viewed as a Biden administration-led initiative. But polling still shows that, depending on how the question is asked, 45 to 55% of Republicans still support arming Ukraine. So show me another policy area in American politics where you have 50% of Republicans supporting what President Biden is doing. There isn't one. So I do believe that there's still strong support, but we have to communicate to the American public better why it's worth it, why it matters to the United States. Whenever, and I think this is one of my biggest criticisms about President Biden. He isn't like, you know, where's the Oval Office speech addressing the American people, why this is important, why this matters? When he does talk about it, he talks about it in vague notions like, well, we're arming Ukraine to protect the international rules-based order, or something like this. Now let me tell you, going back to I've mentioned Missouri a lot today, I feel like, but going back to my family in Missouri, they have no idea what the hell the international rules-based order is. And when they hear that something like this exists, they're immediately suspicious of it, right? And so instead of talking about these vague concepts, talk about, you know, Europe is our largest export market. When your father goes to the factory and builds something, it's going to Europe most likely than not. And that's his job. So, you know, but we don't talk about it like this for some reason. So we have to do a better job of communicating to the people, then they'll put the pressure on Congress that's needed to continue U.S. support.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, please, on the left here.